We stand here in Sherwood Park, Alberta, on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territories of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux, home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta. We are all treaty people.
National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is a nationally declared holiday on September 30th, formerly Orange Shirt Day. This year, September 30th is a Friday. Schools will be closed on this day. This is a somber day to commemorate the horrors of residential schools as acts of genocide against Indigenous peoples. It is a time to honor residential school survivors and their families.
The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for former residential school students and includes emotional and crisis referral services. Services are available around the clock and can be accessed by calling 1-866-925-4419.
Reconciliation. It's a word you often hear, especially when discussing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. But in light of recent events, some aren't sure they even want to talk about reconciliation anymore. When a 15-year-old Anishinaabe girl was found dead, dumped in a river and no one was held responsible, and a young Cree man was shot dead and the shooter was acquitted. Both of these recent cases have re-exposed a deep rift between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's a divide that goes back hundreds of years. When Europeans arrived in North America and began settling the land, they didn't stop at just taking land from Indigenous peoples. They brought with them a policy to snuff out the so-called Indian problem. The first Indian residential schools started opening in the 1870s, the beginning of what some have called the darkest chapter in Canadian history.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
By 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make it mandatory for status Indian children to attend residential school. When their parents refused to send them away, police showed up and forcibly took them. It's estimated that 150,000 children were taken from their families and placed in these schools where they were stripped of their culture and their language. The goal was assimilation, to quote, kill the Indian in the child. Thousands of children died, with some estimates saying the mortality rate was as high as 60% in some of the schools. Those who survived have shared horrific stories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The last residential school closed in 1996. The impacts of those institutions are still palpable today. Indigenous communities have shown incredible resilience in the centuries since Europeans arrived, but the impacts of intergenerational trauma and colonization still run deep. In 2007, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history recognized the damage inflicted by residential schools. Canada formally apologized the following year.
These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
The Residential School Settlement Agreement established a multi-billion-dollar fund to support survivors in their recovery. One of the outcomes of this agreement was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission traveled across the country and heard testimony from thousands of residential school survivors. In 2015, the commission produced its final report. It included 94 calls to action, calls meant to redress the legacy of the residential school system and hopefully lead to reconciliation. So what's changed since then? Some ask if this country has even grasped the truth of our shared history. What actions have been taken? How far have we come? Indigenous people currently account for roughly 5% of the population, and yet nearly half of all the children in care in this country are Indigenous. More than a quarter of the adults locked up in prisons are Indigenous. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls may be well underway, but the deaths and disappearances continue today. It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.
TRC Call to Action number 80.
We call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish as a statutory holiday a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains as a vital component to the reconciliation process.
80. We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to establish as a statutory holiday a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process.
The TRC is about the tens of thousands of former residential school students affected by the residential school system in Canada.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but it's part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages, and through he may learn to read and write, his habits and training, mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who has learned to read and write. Sir John A. Macdonald, 1879.
What happened was I had become a ward of the Children's Aid Society. And they were bound by policy to not divulge any information to you. Like, that's why even I couldn't know who my mom was, where she was, or how to contact her, or anything like that. So none of this stuff was shared. I eventually had to go investigate on my own and find these things out. And they wouldn't even open up to us, Children's Aid. They wouldn't even let us see our own files, you know, which was, to me, was criminal, you know. How dare they take away your own information from you, you know. But a lot of strappings, I recall well the strappings, especially from one nun by the name of Sister Mary Perpetua. And she was a big woman. She towered over all us kids, no matter how big the kids were. And she was larger than the average woman, and of course, and she was fairly husky too. And boy, she used to tie into us with those straps, you know, those ones from the conveyor belts. They put that long. And just both hands up over the shoulder and around, just roundhousers, you know. And but they could never make us cry. You know, you learned never to cry, and you toughened yourself. I developed at a very early stage. I started developing that shell that nothing could crack, nothing. And that was one of the real aftermaths also. When you look at the impact of what those schools did to us, to our system, to our values, you know, and to our emotions, and our ability to express or even just to show love to another individual, because all that was subverted, They never, I remember how hard it was when I first got interested in a woman and lived with her, and how hard it was to relate to her.
It has always been clear to me that the Indians must have some sort of recreation, and if our agents would endeavor to substitute reasonable amusements for the senseless drumming and dancing, it would be a great assistance. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, 1921.
What did you do after residential school?
Just went crazy. I was in there for 8 years, and when I came out, it was just like I was crazy. Drank all the time.
Do you remember what life was like before you went to residential school at home?
Yeah. When I think about it, we were like playing all day long. Nobody ever bothered trying to make us do anything. We were just out there in the woods. I don't know what our parents were doing, but we were out there. Sometimes we'd end up 4 or 5 miles away from home, or just play out all day long. Mm-hmm.
And do you remember what it was like to go home in the summer?
Didn't go.
You stayed at the school? Okay. There's Kleenex here. Are you okay? Do you wanna stop? No, you're okay?
We didn't go. We were so far away from home, the Hydras didn't go home. But the people that went there all the time, they didn't know we didn't go home.
And so for the full 8 years that you were there, you never went home?
No. We didn't go out on weekends, too, because if you had a quarter to go out on the weekend, you could go out, but we never had quarters to go out. So we were locked up for 8 years without getting out.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What about the education? Do you remember any of the things, like did you feel that they gave you any kind of education?
No, because I got really good marks and I could do anything that they told us to do. I don't think they cared about what we did. I think they just wanted us to read a little, maybe sign our name. That was it. They didn't care about anything else. And I don't think they thought that we could do anything.
Mm-hmm. And what about your culture and your language? Did you speak your language before you went to school?
No, I didn't. No.
And did they ever ridicule you and make you feel that your culture?
Well, that one lady, she was real terrible. She said that our parents are going to go to hell and we're nothing but heathens, and she'd just be like that to us every day. She never stopped. She just said, your parents are going to go to hell. We couldn't figure out how come they're going to go to hell. We didn't know what the hell she was talking about ourselves.
And was she a teacher that you had throughout all the years you were there?
She was there for a while. I don't know how long she was there, but she was horrible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any good memories from residential school?
No, when we were talking about trying to remember what was good, anything might have been good, said rock and roll came just when we were there. And that one guy brought in the music to us, and that was about the best thing that I remember.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Davin Report, 1879.
I didn't know, what this place was and who these people were. I remember the first night I stayed up. There was other kids in the room and it was dark. It was so dark and I was scared, huh? But yeah, I remember my first day. It's like, it's like yesterday, right? But you still remember. But, yeah.
Did you have any cousins in there?
Yeah. Actually, I had my nephews were in there. Most of my relations were there. But I didn't really know that, right? I didn't even know they were there because I was only in grade. I think I was in grade 2. I was just starting. So it was scary. But it was. But I used to hear kids crying at night. So did I. But you didn't want to be heard, right? Because the nuns they used to have a room down the hall and they'll check up on you. And even that, being 7, going in a washroom was scary because it was pitch black in there. And we were talking about that red exit light. It was kind of like a triangle, right? And it was an exit light and it used to be always on. And every survivor I talked to remembers that.
I've heard this before from other survivors.
Yeah, and I was gonna I told my cousin, that I nearly took that light when they were taking that building down. But we were, even though they were talking about destroying the buildings so that we forget about this, the government, the white man, their concept is time. With time we forget. And I think it was one of the facilitators was saying that us as Aboriginal people, it's about space, right? See, even though the building's gone, the feelings are still there. Every time we go there, we were talking about this, the memory is there. Even though there's other buildings, they try and cover it up, try and make it look good, right? But the feeling's still there. The memory is still there. So we need to heal those places, because there's a lot of negative emotions, there's a lot of pain there. And I think we need to do that as Aboriginal peoples. Let's put flowers and make it look good, and it doesn't go away. But that's what we discussed last night.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
You can make it into a nice garden, maybe try to grow medicines there to rejuvenate the earth.
But they put a school there, right? Another school with native designs. But for us, the ones that were there, the feeling's still there.
Their education must consist not merely of training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life. Egerton Ryerson, 1847.
Do you remember your first day of school at all?
Well, I remember my first entrance, my first day into the school, into the whole building itself. I don't specifically remember the first day of school, but I remember this massive building and red brick building, and my mother was taking me in. My mother and dad were taking me in, and took me to the playroom down more on the main floor, and and just kind of said goodbye to me and kissed me, and my mom was crying and I didn't know why. I didn't see her after for quite a while.
You didn't know that you were going to be left there?
No. That was the hardest part because I didn't know why I was there, why my mom and dad would leave me in such a place. I didn't know anybody. And the nuns weren't very helpful. They would just tell me to shut up and be quiet. I couldn't do anything about it and just sat there and cried. And we'd all march down the hallways. We weren't allowed to look at the boys, even as little girls. We had the nuns beside us, marching us down the hallways, remember? And if we looked at the boys in crossing, they would hit us on the head with their knuckles, and tell us we were pagans. Tell me I was a pagan. I'd go to hell because I looked at this boy, and different things like that.
Had your parents gone to residential school?
Yes, they did. My father went to LeBret and my mom went to Brandon.
Did they ever talk about that with you?
My mom talked about it a little bit. My dad never really mentioned it. He would just say that he went. He didn't tell me much about his experiences there. But from the way he treated us at different times, he was abusive at times. When he would get angry, he'd kind of lose control and he would hit us on the head like with his knuckles. And that was the same way the nuns did to us, to me when I was there. I remember them doing that. And then as I got older, I kind of correlated the two and realized that my dad had picked this training up from the school and realized that wasn't part of himself. But yeah, he was abusive from the residential school. My mother was more caring, more kind. She was more loving. I don't know where she picked that up from, but she did. She was like that with us, I remember. Me being the oldest one, I remember a lot about my mother because she would hug me and, tell me she loved me. It was a rare occasion my dad would ever do that.
But still you love him?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I love my parents. My parents are both deceased, but there's no doubt that I still respect and honor them. They went through a lot in regards to residential school and what it had done to them emotionally and mentally. And so yeah, being in that school, when I was younger, I was always told what to do. I didn't have a mind of my own. I was belittled. I was called a savage. I was never amount to anything. I was just a dirty old Indian. I was just a dirty Indian, and I wasn't going anywhere in life. And when you're told that long enough, you come to believe that you're nobody, and I felt like a nobody. And being in the school, I had a cousin who was really fair, and she had freckles, and she could fit more into the white society than us. But we always had this kind of game or contest we would play with one another, and that was like, oh, we all wanted to be white. We wanted to be like my cousin. So sometimes we would wash ourselves till we think we were white, and we'd go up to her and try and compare our skins. And it was, at the time we just thought, it was just something that we did. But now that I'm older, I realize that I was losing my identity. And that was a lonely place. Lots of kids, but lonely. I remember sitting in the dormitory, and I knew the direction of home. I knew which direction I came to the school. And I'd always wished that every car that came down that hill be my mom and dad. to take me away from this place.
We were taught that when you light sweetgrass, it takes your prayers up to the Creator. Alma Desiree.
We are resilient as a weed and beautiful as a windflower. We have much to celebrate and to be proud of. Christy Belcourt, Métis artist.
We should never forget. It's a part of who we are as a nation, and this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people. Senator Murray Sinclair.
May your love be pure like an eagle, wisdom be under every stone you turn. Let truth be key to freedom and bind you to the path that holds the light.